Teachers signed up to work at the charter school. It was their free choice, but they got there and discovered, gosh, this place is run more like a factory than I thought it would be. You know, I don't feel I have a voice here, or we can't do something about our working conditions. And they start organizing. You know, the unions are very good about kind of getting the scent of dissatisfied teachers. So there's a number of instances where that sort of thing, excuse me, has happened. But I think you need to sort of keep the distinction clear that you can be a part of a district and sometimes not be in a union, but you can also be in a charter school and be part of the union. That's the teacher's right under federal law. We try to kind of walk a fine line with respect to the general topic of unionization. I belong to 3 unions, not a teachers union. I didn't come up through the classroom, but I was a taxi cab driver in New York City, and I understood the value of a union. You know, when they gave me the worst car in the morning, every morning, and I had to take 2 hours to get it inspected, and that was money out of my pocket, all right? So I'm not reflexively anti-union. I do think that the traditional union contract model is not a good fit for charter schools. The model of having everything prescribed down to the number of minutes that you could spend at lunch, to who does duty here and what conditions you have to put in place to do an extracurricular, that's not a good model for a charter school where you want flexibility, you want to be able to be nimble, you want to be able to change program on a dime if your results show that they have to change, you know? So that's not a good fit. Where there are some instances of the things fitting together is where unions have understood that they can create very thin contracts that don't try to regulate all that stuff, but basically just stick to salary and working conditions, the basic benefits and salary kind of stuff. So, final comment on that though. Back in, I guess it was 2008, I was in Denver for a meeting just before the Democratic Convention when Obama was nominated. And it was a meeting of educational folks to talk about educational issues. And one of the speakers was a fellow who was at that time the managing director of Uncommon Schools. He had started a great charter school, Roxbury Prep in Boston. And he was then one of the managing directors of this wonderful charter network called Uncommon Schools. His name was John King. Does his name ring a bell? He is now the Secretary of Education. He is, technically he's interim, but he's filling out the last year of Arnie Duncan's term as interim Secretary of Education. In between, he's been the New York State Commissioner of Education. He's a remarkable guy. Someone who, followed his Twitter feed, get to know him. He's an amazing guy. But he was asked a question much like yours. And he was asked, are you seeing trouble getting teachers to come to you? Because Uncommon worked in a non-union environment, every one of their campuses. And he said, and the question was, does that cause a problem? And John said, for every opening that we have, I get about 80 resumes from teachers. And he says these are almost all teachers who are currently working in district environments under a union contract. And I finally started asking him, why are you willing to come work for us, to move from all the protections you got under a union contract to a situation where you're going to be on 1-year at-will agreements with us? He said there are 2 things that they told me over and over again. One, that I want to work in a school that has a good chance of succeeding with disadvantaged kids. And 2, I want to work next to somebody who's as passionate about that as I am. And to me, that really spoke volumes. There's a lot of wonderful teachers, including teachers who are working in districts, who would love to have the opportunity of really putting that passion to work and being in an environment where they can really get terrific results. And so I don't think we have a huge pipeline issue generally. There are places where we do for sure, but I thought that comment is probably still very pertinent today. I'm sorry, that was a much longer answer than you were looking for.
No, it was great.
You mentioned before about how charter schools can sometimes overcome financial disadvantage they're at with on capital funds. You mentioned state bonds and shared co-located facilities.
Yeah.
Are there any other strategies that come to mind to help charter schools overcome that financial disadvantage?
Well, I think to me, the $64 question is, how do you create a level playing field between charters and other public schools? And I emphasize other public schools. And I've had my own kind of journey on this. I early on was kind of the thought that, well, we should probably make sure that charters get established and, prove their mettle before we start, trying to talk about providing the facilities and all that sort of stuff. But especially when I was in DC and saw that they regarded it as a level playing field and they put the facilities money right in the budget. And again, when I say $3,000 per pupil each year, you can imagine the kind of money that generates. And I see jaws dropping sometimes when I say that. That to me is kind of the real solution in terms of, finding a revenue stream that is the equal of what other public schools spend. I mean, there are various stopgap measures. You mentioned a couple of them. There are other ways in which states can create revolving loan funds. There, of course, is always private money. A lot of the facilities around the country are actually started through private philanthropy, or because charter schools actually hold back a portion of their income year to year to year. That's one of the things that at charter schools, if they really have budget autonomy and really have budget flexibility, unlike the district school, they don't have to spend down to zero at the end of every year. So they can, actually be frugal and put money in the building fund. And that's where you finally wind up getting your down payment 4, 5, 6 years down the road. So there's all these kind of stopgap ways. But I wrote a paper a couple of years ago called An Accident of History. It's a very pretentious title, I realize. But the point I was trying to make with that title is that when the rules were determined about who owns school facilities, and I traced this back to, I'm not kidding you, 1648, the very, very first American schools. When the rules were written about who owns facilities, who gets to allocate public school facilities, how they're financed, there was only one kind of public school. It was run by a traditional public school district. So our whole array of laws and policies around that was always written to fit traditional public schools. There were no charter schools when those things were developed. There just wasn't another kind of public school at that point. So it's only in recent years that you've had this challenge on the facility side. We've broken the monopoly on educational services, but we still have largely a monopoly of district ownership of all these assets on the facility side. And there's just a very few places around the country where you've seen some really far-sighted leadership about this. Paul Frederick, who's the former superintendent in Louisiana, after Hurricane Katrina, and after they had to literally rebuild the city, including the school system, most of the schools were just flooded and completely wrecked. I mean, they had to really do this amazing job. The state allocated something like $2 billion for the rebuilding of public school assets. And he made a critical decision. He said, we are going to be agnostic as to governance. What that meant was, he said, we're going to provide the money and we're going to start building the facilities. Who goes in those facilities, whether it's a district school or a charter school, we don't know yet. These are all public schools, and we're going to start building the public school infrastructure. And as it turns out today, most of those buildings are occupied by charter schools. So, that's one of the rare cases. And I mentioned Prop 39 in California, where the district, if it approves a school, has to make provision for facilities for the school. And that's another way of kind of expressing the level playing field, right? A number of the districts had to be taken to court to enforce that, because they would give a school a room in this building and a room in that building and a room in that building and call it equivalent, That said, at least the intent of the law is to say these are all public schools. If you approve a public school, a public charter school, you have to make provision for the facilities. And I think that's the long-term solution. Yeah.
That to me seems like such a no-brainer. I simply don't understand why it's not already part of what happens. I mean, we're a public school.
Yeah.
So I don't really understand. Can you give me some insight into the history of why that would not be considered part of a charter, like
I'd love to recite the entire paper that I wrote on this. It is called, I would actually recommend it to you if you're interested in the actual backstory. It's called An Accident of History. You can probably, if you just Google that with my name, you may find it on the National Alliance website. But in essence, you know, in Shepherdstown, how many of you have been to Shepherdstown, where I live? Okay. Do you know, if you go down that little side street, Princess Street, that there's this little tiny red brick building that is a one-room, it was a one-room schoolhouse. That was the first public school building in West Virginia in 1848, and it's still there. Well, I mean, the simple answer is, until like the mid-1800s, building a school was just something that wasn't that big a deal. It was a small building for a few kids, and the community would just get together and they'd basically raise a barn or build a little red brick building. So they didn't think in terms of creating any kind of separate structure for financing the building and going to the bond market and all. It wasn't needed in those days. And that just stayed, that responsibility just stayed with the school district. So if you look at the way cities run, who builds the buildings for other parts of city government? Well, they have a municipal building authority or something like that. But the school district still is in charge of building and maintaining and overseeing and allocating all its own space. So this, as I say, this had deep historic roots why there is this monopoly. And the charter school movement is the first time in history that there's been a serious challenge to that, where in these little skirmishes that we have in California and New York and other places, we've begun to make a dent in that monopoly. But we have a far way to go to get that established as a real principle of parity between charters and other public schools.
So when people started charter schools, did they just say, look, you don't have to give me a building?
Yeah.
Oh, really? So
Well,
they just
Look,
screwed it from the beginning. That's
I mean, I think we can probably take some responsibility, not me personally, but other people. No, but seriously, I mean, there's a lot of ways in which we compromised in the early days to get the laws on the books. Let's just get the foot in the door, you know? And that's really literally true. I mean, there are people in our movement who always wanted the perfect law, and if you don't get the perfect charter law, walk away from the deal, have the governor veto it, all that. It's not the way it actually works. Every year we get, like you saw in Maryland this year, you do your best. And there's other forces at work, and there's lobbyists in the lobby and all that, and you get half a loaf, but you make incremental progress. This is one of the areas where I think people just didn't anticipate that it would be such a big deal. Because remember, going back to early ancient charter history, the way we thought of charter schools is that they're, you know, little schools, a few teachers will get together. In fact, you know, maybe one classroom would do it. I mean, it was really very, very small scale. They were boutiques that were going to exist kind of way on the margins of education. Now, look around you. I mean, you can go into DC and see the size of some of the schools there. We have a school in California that's 3,000 students, you know. I mean, charter schools are regular old public schools in many cases now. So because we didn't get this at the outset, we still find ourselves having to compromise and not having playing fields, not having facility, cafeterias, not having chem labs, the sorts of things that we associate with American public schools, you know. So we're having to play catch up on that. And it's, you know, it's too bad that we have to still keep doing it.
One of the big challenges we have here is transportation. So I was wondering in DC and in other parts of the country, is busing provided, first of all? And since we're not getting busing here, what are your thoughts about how to go about, you know, how do we go about trying to do that? How are charter school kids getting to school in other parts of the country?
I don't have comprehensive information on this. In DC, I think it's the same rule as here. The city doesn't basically bus most kids in DC. After a certain age, I think middle school, they get vouchers for Metro or buses and things like that. They do bus special ed kid students, and they do make that available to charter schools. And I think that's probably the way it's done in a lot of jurisdictions. I couldn't give you any kind of serious answer about this. I know that it's often a sore point, and there are some cities where, you know, if they bus all the kids in the system, they bus the charter kids too. The problem, of course, is that the transportation systems literally are set up to accommodate zone schools, you know. And so you put charters in the mix, and these kids are coming from 14 different zones. And, you know, how do you make that work in a district that's set up for a very tightly zoned environment? So I have a little bit of sympathy for the district planners about that, and I know it's a sore point. It involves, you know, it involves money for the charter school.
Well, what's interesting is that here in Frederick, of course, we don't have busing, and it says right in the charter school, you know, laws on FCPS about busing, that if it's on a route that's an established bus route, then busing can be provided. Well, every afternoon I see a bus drive down Gas House Pike, a school bus. So, you know, what do we do with that? I mean, we can go to the school board. Ultimately, the 7 people that sit on that school board really decide, you know, how we're going to get transportation and if we're going to get transportation. I don't think of a county of this size with buses coming and going and schools all around us, it would be that difficult to have pickup spots. We're not in the inner city, you know, it's very suburban. But, you know, all the kids that go to our school live in neighborhoods where there's a neighborhood school probably just a couple miles from their house. So to me, it would be easy to do busing. We have buses already. And I just wonder, in a suburban type situation like we have, the possibility of areas, maybe 3 or 4 pickup spots in a county that already have buses going to a school. Maybe, you know, our kids would go to the local elementary school. A bunch of kids, this would be a pickup spot for this region of the county.
Have you proposed that to them?
I haven't, because I'm not quite sure what's happening in other, you know, other parts of the state.
This is a case where I wouldn't worry too much about other jurisdictions, because these things are very site-specific.
Yeah.
And, you know, where transportation really is, our biggest issue is in places where we have an urban core, and then you have some suburban counties or cities, all in the same jurisdiction, this way, big municipal area. And we get accused sometimes of basically resegregating schools, because a lot of our charter schools locate in the middle of the inner city, because that's where the kids are that they want to serve. You know, they're not fussy, the founders are typically not fussy about counting heads, making sure that we have exact you know, balance and diversity and so forth. They want to serve the kids where they are, you know. So it really is an issue if we want to get those kids to a jurisdiction that's a little bit farther out, or get other kids to come in, but we don't get any transportation to us. That would help resolve some of the diversity issues that we have in some areas, but typically that's not provided. I would just go to them with a good plan, and I would say, look, we see that bus going by every morning, you know, and maybe have a few other spies around the city that could help build that case. I think the inevitable pushback that you'll get is it's logistically difficult and it will cost too much. And not being expert on your budget, I couldn't tell you, you know, what kind of game you have there. But I would just make a case.
So the question I've always had is, what is everybody so afraid of? I mean, in the sense that I can give up the oversight, and you know what I mean, say, yeah, you can have all the oversight that you want. You know, we give the proposal, the charter, and this is what we say we want to do, and you are there to make sure that everything is implemented, test scores and all of that stuff. Because I've always been confused in this argument over school choice and everything, because it seems to me, if you ask pretty much anybody, they would say, I mean, teachers will say, anybody, kids learn differently. Every student learns differently. So as a parent paying taxes for a public school system, why would you not be allowed to say, my child, I believe my child would be much more fulfilled in a Montessori environment, or a classical environment, or a traditional environment. I don't think any school system is set up to fail, or I don't think Frederick County Public Schools are bad. But I just am always like, why are you so afraid are they afraid that we're going to succeed and make them look bad? I mean, as a county, don't you think that they would have full backing behind us? They approved us. My thing that I guess I get frustrated with the board is you approved us. I mean, you know, you approved the charters that are here, the Montessori us. So put everything behind it to make us be successful, because that should fall on you too. I mean, why would you approve something that you want to ultimately fail? And I know members change and all of that stuff, but once it's already in place, then I would think they would be coming to you saying, do you have the resources? I know you have the charter, but what is it that is missing? So what is the fear? I mean, I'm just like,
Well,
what's the fear?
That's a great question, and there's so many different ways of kind of coming at it. I will say that, first of all, I like to believe the best of people, and there have been times when I've had to be a real partisan about charters and fighting the evil districts and all that. I think most people who are in this business on either side really want to do the right thing, and I think that it is sometimes a sort of a clash of values. So that when you talk about having a charter school, for example, it immediately raises the question, not of are they going to be better than us, but what happens to the notion of the community-based district that we've had for 100 years now? And we're very familiar with the set of laws and protections and guarantees that we're living with. And it's easier to make the case sometimes for a charter school when you're in a really terrible district whose kids are at the bottom of the barrel academically and the buildings are run down. You want to get them the hell out of there, And if you can offer them something that's distinctively different, there is a moral case for doing it, no matter what. It's a little bit harder sometimes in a district like this where, as far as I know, they're doing a pretty good job. And what you're saying is, we think that there are different approaches that ought to be tried. And for one reason or another, we don't see that happening in the context of the district. So sometimes the district will see that as a challenge for them to try and provide that. And you'll see sometimes when an application comes in, a district try to outflank the charter applicant by saying, okay, we'll set up a Montessori school. You don't have to now, So there is that competition. Other times, the district will see it in an enlightened kind of way that you're thinking of, where it's all, they're all our kids. These are all our kids. And there's some wonderful places around the country. Mention Denver again, because the superintendent there, Tom Boasberg, has that philosophy. And the charters and the district schools are all part of his portfolio. It starts with having that basic philosophy. But there are also some ways that policy can reinforce that. There are districts who, in the era of high accountability, particularly under No Child Left Behind, basically made bargains with their charter schools that if you do well, we will incorporate your scores into our rolled-up district tally, and that's how we'll be held accountable. So they're rooting for that charter school because it will raise their scores. Now, there may be a quid pro quo. It may be that they make space available to the charter for the privilege of boosting their scores. There's a little bit of handling that goes on in these cases. But there are ways that the incentives can change so that the district is encouraged to have that attitude rather than to see it as a zero-sum game. The fact is that districts are financially strapped all around the country. I don't know specifically about Frederick. Looks like the place is doing pretty well, but let's just stipulate that this is a strapped district like every other one. So anything that's going to take resources out of the district is a question. I think that if the relationship is set up so that charters want to buy services from the central office, for example, the central office can make some money on that proposition. If the central office is willing to rent unused space, they can recoup financially that way. There are ways that you can kind of change the dynamics and change the incentives so that the relationship doesn't become antagonist. Yeah. Right.
Just an ending, I know you wanted to end with why the new Maryland law you said was possibly a step in the right direction, and I would love to hear why that would be.
Well, that's right. Thank you for reminding me of that. I think what happened in this last session is that you had a governor with really good instincts and wanted to be on the side of the angels. I don't know exactly what happened in the legislative meat grinder, but there was a real effort to break through on the autonomy front. And so, number one, there was a list of things that were now waived for charter schools in state regulation. I don't have the whole list, but that's a step in the right direction because Maryland is one of those states where they don't grant charter schools a general waiver. In other words, in many states, they say if you're a charter school, you are exempt from these 175 provisions of the state code affecting education. Charter schools and public schools are always subject to federal law, civil rights protections, all that stuff, and much of state code, but all the regulations that apply to schools, in a lot of states, they give you a general waiver. So you start off with a whole bunch of flexibility about how you buy your textbooks and what kind of curriculum clearances you need and all that sort of stuff. So that's one very positive step. The most critical thing, though, was in the area of personnel. And I think there was an effort to really decouple the charters from the district hiring practices. You know, going back to your question about unions, as I've talked to a few people in the state, I get the sense that the tension is not so much that, you know, teachers might be part of the union, it's that you have to deal with the rigmarole of the district HR process, you know. And so the kind of compromise that was reached was that for schools that are in place more than 5 years, I guess whether they've gone through a renewal, but they're 5 years, and they have basically performed well. I don't know exactly what the criteria are, but they've basically been in good standing, they've fulfilled their admission and so forth, they've done okay on the state test, that there will have to be a more collaborative process in hiring. The teacher has to indicate that she wants to be in that school, the school has to indicate that they want that teacher in the school, and that will be written into law for those schools. There will be no, what's the word, designation of a principal to a school without the school's consent. So it sounds to me like this from conversations earlier that these are kind of things that have sort of been worked out here in one way or another, but it's not been in the law. So for all these other districts and other schools around the state, basically they've been at the mercy of the central offices. So I think, you know, you want to have the whole cake, the whole loaf of bread, you want to have full autonomy, but that's what we're able to get this session. And it seems to me that those are good things, and they don't work for new schools, which is a shame. And that's the place to go next time, it seems to me. And eventually they get full incorporated autonomy. Yes?
So, as a parent, I mean, what are your next steps? I mean, I have 3 kids here, and I'm a busy mom. I work 2 jobs. My husband works 2 jobs. And it's not often that we can come to things like this and advocate for our school and be heard by the governing bodies that are making these decisions. You know, I have 2 children with special needs who are better served in a smaller class size and individualized attention. But we're not getting all the help from the board, you know, from the school system to have all the resources here that they might need. What are our next steps? I mean, for your everyday Joe Schmo who can't be out there with a billboard and, you know, saying school choice.
Well, I'm going to, not being able to really address the specifics of this relationship and how your dynamics with the board work, I would just sort of say a few fairly general things. Number one, as with the transportation case before, you need to make a case and you need to prioritize what are the most important things that need to be done this year, this session, and make as tight a case as possible so that it's easily described in English and it doesn't require huge stress for the board members to understand and to understand its importance. Number two, can it be described as a win-win? Now, for example, you mentioned your special needs children. I would imagine that the district is responsible for special education.
Yeah, we have buyback,
Okay, all right. So,
buyback of special ed services.
all right, well, that may be a win-win then in terms of the way your budget works. Try to emphasize win-win cases. Number three, affiliate with other schools and with the movement in the state. You've got an organization here called Maryland Can. Jason Botel, who used to run KIP, runs that now. He's a terrific guy. I think, capitalize on his knowledge and the leverage that gives you if it's happening in more than one place. And it's always good to be able to do that. And also, usually, don't be shy about national resources, too. The National Alliance is in D.C. We're in Chicago, NACSA. It never hurts to ask whether they and their state affiliates. I think Maryland Can is not the state affiliate of the National Alliance. I think there's a Maryland Alliance also. But, work with those organizations because they can tell you you, well, you know, so-and-so over in Annapolis had that same issue, and here's how they resolved it. You know, so there's not only strategies, but also the content of the issue. And number 4, I realize everybody's busy. This is a great turnout tonight. The fact is that school boards are influenced by people showing up. You know, in a perfect world, we'd all just make wonderful deliberative decisions based solely on evidence. But the fact is, if you have a bunch of kids in t-shirts and if their parents are there, you all vote. You know, so that's the fact. When it comes to the vote, when it comes to the public hearing, be prepared to make the case. You know? So I mean, that's just the basic advocacy 101. Certainly, if there's any way I can help going forward, I'm right down the road. So you know, they've got my number. It also, by the way, doesn't hurt to have a friend in the local newspaper too. Seriously, no, seriously. I mean, you want to be fair and you want to be accurate and you don't want to make wild charges, but you also want to say, you know, we want to get this policy changed, and here's the human example of why. Here's my 2 kids, or here's my daughter who, you know, I have to drive an hour to get her to school in the morning because there's no bus, or whatever. You know, it's that human story that will actually make the difference in people's lives.
We actually do have 2 sign-up sheets in the back. One is for people to stay in the loop just by emails from Ann at Advocacy Group here at the Frederick Classic First. Another one is for anybody who wants to sign up to be involved in the Advocacy Committee. So they're on the back table.
Well, let me add one other thing that is not directly related to sort of the school board itself, but because you're in a district, the more that you can talk about your successes and let people know what good stuff is happening here in a variety of ways, but also invite the district in, invite other schools in, invite collaborations with other schools. One of the best things that the school I mentioned in the district where I served on the board, one of the best things they did was to start a teaching fellows program with 3 other charter schools that became a source of professional development for teachers in DC public schools, not in charter schools. And that was a great piece of bridge building. So, you know, it helps to strengthen those relationships on a school-to-school grassroots basis too, I think. Anything else?
Yeah.
We're good? Okay.
Thank you. And there's like Mike was saying, there's sign-up sheet in the back here to get a start.
There is a Facebook, but we're also.
There is, it's called Frederick Champions for Charter Schools. And if you want to like that, you'll see a lot of postings that I'll put up or our committee puts up in support of charter schools or what's going on with some of the legislation. So check that out. And Twitter, we do a little bit of FCCS Twitter stuff, FCCS_school. So thank you all for coming.
And there's a YouTube channel also that I guess this video hopefully be on.
Oh, nice.
I was just aware of it.